Welcome again. I hope you are keeping up with our content and you are following these videos and you have a positive feedback. When we look at the domain 1 content, we will find that domain 1 is separated to two main parts. The first part is about audit planning and the second part is about audit execution. We are still in the first part, which is concerned about audit planning. So let's see what is the topic of this video. When we see an audit process, we generally find that audit is categorized of series of planned activity. The first activity that we need to do while doing an audit is to do an audit charter. An audit charter is a mandatory requirement in order to establish the internal audit function in the organization. Any department, any team, any role in your organization or any function should have a clear responsibility. What audit charter do is that it defines the responsibility and authority of the audit department inside your organization. So the first part or the first step in building an audit in your organization is the audit charter. And I believe we discussed what does audit charter mean in great much of details. The second part is to do an audit pre-planning. In pre-planning, we do a kind of understanding the business, understanding the context of the clients that we will be auditing to, squadding the team, do the regular training in order to maintain the competency and the skills of the audit team, and so on. And once we identify the target or the business process that we are going to, let's say, select which part of it will be audited, we do a kind of check to understand what is the most important process or asset that we need to do an audit on it. Because let's understand that you don't have the adequate resources as an auditor or an audit department to review and check anything in your organization. You only have a limited budget and limited time and also a limited resources. So you need to manage these resources in a proper way. That's what risk management or risk assessment help you to do. Risk assessment is basically help you to identify what are the highest areas of risk in your organization so you can categorize it to high and medium and low risk areas, and you probably will select the highest risk area in order to do your audit on it. Based on the risk assessment result, you will understand that if the audit is possible or not. Once you confirm that the audit is possible and you already identified the scope that you will be auditing to, you perform an audit. During performance of the audit or during the inspection of the assets and the processes, you are trying to gather as much evidence as you can, because you cannot build a conclusion without doing an evidence. You're doing your audit test, you're doing your business, your use cases on your application, you are collecting data, marking in the checklist or the forms that you are using, and then you analyze these reports or analyze this result in order to form a conclusion. Last but not least, you report the finding in your auditing report, and then after reporting your finding and close the audit mission, you need to make a follow-up. And the reason for doing a follow-up is to ensure that the auditee adhere to the finding or made a fix for the finding that you just described or just you mentioned in your audit report. And by the way, the follow-up timing vary. You can follow up after 1 week, 2 months, 1 month. All of these times are depending on the severity of the findings. So this is a good point to mention in relation to the exam. And don't worry, upon completing domain 1, we will answer some questions related to all these parts that we discussed in order to gain understanding about how can such question come in the real ISAC exam. So in audit planning, the first thing that we need to discuss is what to audit. And I believe we discussed that in the context of the last slide when we said that we are doing a risk assessment. So you first list all processes that may be considered for an audit. You evaluate each processes by performing a risk assessment, and you define the overall risk of each process. Last but not least, build your audit plan that include processes related or rated with the highest risk. The all processes that you could consider for the audit is called the audit universe. And the audit plan that you created will consider the high areas of risk. That's what risk-based audit planning imply. The risk-based audit planning is to plan for your audit based on the resource or include in the scope of your audit the resources or the assets or the processes that will include or that will bring the high area of risk. So you are doing this part in order to save the budget or comply with the requirement. Because as we said, one of the essential skills for the IS auditor is the project management. In project management, we are concerned about doing our task or doing our project in time and within in time and within budget. So we have limited resources and we need to act according to these resources. So simply you are selecting the highest areas of risk and you are planning your audit based on it. I hope that is clear. We have two types of audit planning. The first one is the short-term planning, and short-term planning include the issues and audit issues that will be covered during the year. And we have the long-term planning, and long-term planning consider all risk-related issues that may affect the organizational strategy direction. And we do the long-term planning by assessing the changes or the possible changes in the strategic direction of the organization. So short-term planning is mainly about the years that we are currently in, and long-term planning is considering the strategic direction of the organization and all risks that may arise during the change in organization strategic direction. We need also to understand that the plan, both type of plans should be reviewed and updated and approved by the senior management. So senior management need to understand what is the scope of the audit, how the audit could be conducted, and so on. In the planning steps, let's include what we just discussed. In the planning steps, we need to do understanding for business mission, objective, and processes. We need to understand business environment, risk, challenges, and changes, because if we don't understand the business mission, objective, and processes, we will not be able to adequately review the policy. As I said earlier, the policy is reflecting the management intention. So when we understand the mission, the objective of the organization, which is communicated by the board of directors, we will be able to understand and review the policies in a good way. We will ensure that the policy is complying and aligning with the business requirement. Also, by understanding business environment and risks related to this business and challenges in the market and changes in the market, we can have a good look about the risk and how to assess it in a proper way. Review previous work papers means that we ask the auditee to provide us with all the old audit reports to see the findings in the last audit, because this will be a good candidate to check against. If we found that in the last audit reports we have many findings related to a certain processes, we will be interested to ensure that are these findings, which was a result or which was communicated in the last audit, has been closed or not. We also need to review policies, standards, and understand what are the laws and regulations that our business or that this business is obligated to comply with it. We also need to understand the organization structure, because that will assist the auditor in understanding the line of reporting and understand the possible ways or the possible opportunities to have conflict of interest or missing the segregation of duty, and we will discuss what does these two terms mean in great much of details later in this course. After then, we perform a risk assessment to identify high areas of risk after listing all the after listing the audit universe as we discussed. Then we set the scope and then we develop the audit strategy, which means the way that we are doing the audit based on it. Then we build the audit team and we, as audit management, start to handle the logistics, the accommodation, how we will mobilize the audit team, how would we transfer it to the audit location to do the business mission, where does will or where they will stay, what is other logistics, and so on. So this is fairly a lot of things to care about, but it is very important to understand that you need to do all of this in order to understand the business mission, to understand the processes, perform risk assessment, and so on. So this is some of the good points that I need to mention about how to understand business. You can research business mission, objective, processes. You can review business plan and the strategy. Remember that the strategy is created or is communicated by the board of directors. So it is very important to ensure that all internal processes are aligned with the strategy. You need to gain overview about the industry challenges and trends. For instance, if I am auditing a bank or I am auditing in a financial sector, I need to understand the blockchain. I need to understand the privacy regulation. We also may have a new trend that is currently in the data center technology, which is the containerization and Kubernetes, which change the how data centers work. We are transferring now to a serverless computing, so as a cloud technology, for instance. So you as an auditor need to understand these challenges and these new trends that may affect the business to stay competent as per the CISA professional code of ethics. You need also to review last audit paper, understand business environment, have a view on policies. So that's fairly most of the speaking or most of the statement that we discussed in our last slide. Part of the things that we discussed about understanding the business is to understand the laws and regulations that your business or the auditee will be obligated to comply with it. So laws and regulation may affect a certain industry, such as banks and internet service provider. Social media websites are obligated to comply with a certain regulations. If you are a citizen from the European Union, you may have the GDPR regulation, which is concerned about the data privacy. And if you are processing data for Europe citizens and so on, you need to care about GDPR. If you are processing card information, you need to comply with a standard called payment card industry. So you need to understand what is the industry that you are going to audit on it, and what are the challenges or what are the regulations that this industry should be complying with it. Legal regulation may be related to financial operation and the IS audit functions. For instance, you may find a regulation that enforce the organization to keep the audit report for a period of 7 years. That's what happened for some regulation. Audit report must be maintained for a specific years or a specific duration. So legal regulation govern a lot of things. One of these things is data retention and the retention of audit report, and this is just one example. Legal regulation can be placed on the audit or auditee, and what we mean here is that legal regulations may enforce the auditee to report audit findings. For instance, if he find an illegal act to the law enforcement authorities instantly. So this can happen, and that's what we mean when we say that legal regulations may be placed not just on the auditor, but it can be also, or not just on the auditee, but it can also be placed on the auditee and auditor, of course. Failure to comply with legal regulation may lead to financial and reputational damage. For instance, if you are or if you fail to comply with the GDPR, so you will have to pay a huge fine, and you have an interesting website that is related or documenting all fines are that was a result for non-complying with regulations such as the GDPR. And I really encourage you to read about what is the GDPR. You need to understand it, what is the content of it. It will help you a lot, because the privacy regulations are spreading right now. We have currently a privacy regulation in Egypt. We have a privacy regulation in Saudi Arabia. We have a privacy regulation in the United States. So privacy regulation will be the norm in our upcoming years. Some industry standard may be very important, such as the BCI. BCI is not a regulation, however, it is an industry standard, and this standard require all card payment or card processing organizations to be complying with BCI in order to gain some approval from in regard to processing data or processing card data. So, although the PCI DSS is not a regulation, but it could be a mandatory for some business sector to comply with it. We need to understand the difference between the law and act and regulation. As you can see here, the constitution is the parent or the big umbrella. Under the constitution, we may find laws, and depending on law, we have an act, and an act could result in creating a regulation, and in regulation, we have the rules. So this is what is the relation between these five parts. So we need also to understand some of the key regulations that is in the market. We have the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and Sarbanes-Oxley Act is concerned about the SEC companies that are participating in the stock exchange in United States, and it require organizations that are working in this market or in the US market and related to SEC to disclose their audit or do a disclosure for or do a testing after disclosing their reports, and enforce the liability on the board of directors and the senior management by requiring them to sign the financial reports. We have also another regulation, which is a Gramm-Leach-Paley Act, which is related to data protection and also reliability. We have Basel Accord standard, which is about risk management. We have the HIPAA, and HIPAA is related to a privacy of medical reports. We have the FISMA, and FISMA is a security control standard, which is related to federal organization or federal entity in the United States. We have the General Data Privacy Regulation, which is stand for or and which is abbreviated to the GDPR, and it is a data privacy regulation. We have also the PCI DSS, and as we said, it is not a regulation, it is a standard. You are not required to memorize all of this, but you by the time will understand that whenever you see HIPAA, this is related to privacy of medical reports. Whenever you see PCI DSS, it is related to card number and instruction. Whenever you see GDPR, it is related to data privacy. Of course, there are a lot of regulations and the standards available in the market, but this is just a list of the well-known that you may encounter during your work. So, ISU auditor should identify legal requirement to assure business compliance and document it to ensure that during his audit mission will ensure that the requirement of these standards are well met. Some regulations have procedures that support the compliance. We can use these procedures as a checklist. For instance, in BCI, we have as a standard, of course, we have a list of requirements. So we can create or we can have a checklist for self-assessment for BCI requirements and use it as a checklist during our audit. Note that some types of certification or some types of standards has its own audit. For instance, if you are trying to certify against PCI DSS, you have a PCI DSS audit. If you are trying to certify against ISO, you have an ISO audit. If you are trying to get a SOC report, SOC, Service Organization Control, which we discussed earlier in this course, you have a SOC audit. So that's all related to compliance audit, and we need to pay attention that BCI is not a regulation, but it is a standard for certain organization. ISO 27K is also not an organization, not a regulation. It is a standard, but being ISO certified can support you and give you a competitive advantage across your or over your competent or same peers in your business. We need also discuss when to audit. Normally, we do an audit on yearly basis. In some cases, audit may be performed out of this normal date. For instance, if we have a control and this control have an issues, we can do an audit to check why this control is not performing in a good way. If we had a major change in risk environment, for instance, we was working in a private cloud form and then we decided to move to public cloud. So once we move to public cloud, we need to do an audit because the risk environment has been changed. We also use or we also do audit out of the norm of normal schedule in case we had an enhanced evaluation form. For instance, we did an audit using Away, and during the year we discovered that the way that we did the audit with was not a very accurate and what wasn't a very optimum way. So we now have another way that is more accurate and will produce more credible data. So that is, in this case, we have the case of enhanced evaluation. We have a new way to check that haven't been considered during past report. Or when we have a significant problem and the audit report may be requested for investigation reasons. So that was all for this video. In this video, we understood the audit planning, what are regulations and what are the standards, and we understood also when to audit and what are the types of audit planning. We discussed the short term and long term. So I hope this was informative and I hope you are enjoying the course. Please show your support by sharing the video and let me know in your comments if you have any questions or if you have anything to say.